And we're live. Thank you for watching Orthodox Christian Theology. I'm Craig, if you don't know who I am. Probably do. That's what the little thing on YouTube says. I can't even figure out how to change the name of it because I'm so bad at technology. Today with me is Subdeacon Daniel Kakish. For those who don't know, he's an Oriental Orthodox subdeacon, but he's got cred because his lineage is Eastern Orthodox. So he actually has feet, in both camps in some sense. There's this ethnic identity, but also his convictions. And also, I think my last show in Reason Theology was with you, if I remember right. And we went back and forth on the schism, and I have to say, it's rare to speak with someone that's so well informed. I would say you had the better of that exchange, which I'm grateful for. I still think I'm right. You still think you're right. That's not the point. But but that's why it's great to have you on. For those who don't know, Subdeacon Dan, he'll send me stuff that's pro his position, against his position, and read stuff. A true desire for the truth. And I will not say any more compliments for the sake of his salvation. So I'll just cut it off there. So it's good to have you this afternoon on short notice.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you for having me. Praise God.
Praise God. So and praise God today. And I don't know about California, New York. It's beautiful weather. Yeah. And I came home to clean my COVID groceries because I don't think I could get sick worshiping God, but I could get sick anywhere in that proximity, plus going food shopping, plus not cleaning my groceries. COVID is everywhere, theoretically speaking. So after I got that, I was listening to a recent show in Recent Theology on Dr. Sebastian Brock. Do I have the right name?
Yes, sir.
Right. And they go, wait, you're doing a show on a guy, you don't even know his name. This is important because very often we comment on people or speak about people and we don't really know about them. We're not experts in them. I'm gonna show my hand right now. I have not read Dr. Sebastian Brock's translations. I've read very little St. Ephrem. The little I have is open source. Open source translations. So I'm presuming those are 100 years old. And Dr. Sebastian Brock is pretty old. He did not translate them. He's 82. So that'd be impossible. But that's why Subdeacon Dan, I want to speak to him first about the issues in Ephrem the Syrian. And because he goes to seminary and has to read things that Dr. Sebastian Brock wrote and translated, he is someone that actually has good background in this, unlike me. So first, let's talk about St. Ephrem the Syrian more broadly. From what I know, and I want you to correct me, he's one of the great fathers who didn't write in Greek. He wrote in Syriac. That doesn't preclude that they translated things into Greek, obviously. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't be venerated by the Eastern Orthodox at this point. I'm guessing. Who knows? Can't read into the past. But that being said, he was a true theologian, not within the Hellenistic worldview per se, authentically Syrian, right? So a Christian with an ethnic identity and a worldview that is somewhat different than what we're used to when we always say East and West, Cappadocians and Greeks, Egyptian Greeks, Latins in North Africa, Latins in Italy. Here's someone with a different background, different worldview, and obviously shares the same faith. He's a saint venerated by both our communions. So that being said, because it's a little I know about him, why is he such an important saint? And how about you get into that, and then we'll unpack this, Dan.
Sure. So there's a famous psalter in English that is attributed to him. It's printed by St. John Press, Eastern Orthodox. It's really nicely published. It looks kind of fancy. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I asked Dr. Brock about the Psalter, and he said that it is not authentic to Ephrem. And he's saying most because scholars, they never usually say generalities like all or something. So he's saying most Greek Ephrem is not genuine today.
Well, let me interrupt. What's your opinion on that?
I agree with him. I think that Greek Ephrem, if you compare Greek Ephrem, even in his poetry, with Syriac Ephrem, the goal and the intention of the writer is different. The Greek Ephrem intentionally is dogmatic, even in his poetry, whereas the Syriac Ephrem is not. And also Latin Ephrem also has the same issues as the Greek Ephrem does. Now, I think he's venerated in all of our communions because he was venerated very early on in church history, before the schisms. And he was just a deacon. And like you said, he was on the fringes of the empire anyway. It speaks to his greatness, how well known he became just as a deacon and living kind of in the corner of the empire. And the other thing is because he's so highly regarded, everyone wants him to prove their tradition or that tradition. And so then you will find that he is one of the most fathers of all, who has probably more forgeries or more works attributed to him than we actually have his genuine works translated. We have a lot more of his genuine works, but they haven't been translated yet.
Now, let's speak of the issue of forgeries for a second. How does a scholar, or you who's imbibing in scholarship, you're in seminary, critically look at something and come to the judgment of this is definitely fraudulent, or something written in honor of him, but he didn't really write it, a forgery, or this is probably a forgery? How exact of a science is this? How about you give us your perspective on it?
My perspective, obviously, it's not going to be like a scholar like Brock, who would know a lot more than I would, but just from things like very obvious things. So, for example, in the Psalter, he's clearly talking about Chalcedon or Chalcedonian issues or controversies post Chalcedon, 5th century, 6th century things, saying things like Mother of God, which we believe in, by the way, but Ephrem never used it. We know he believes it from the creed that his church was saying at that time, and we know he believed it from his own Christology that we see from his poems, but not because he actually used the word. He didn't. But in the Psalter, you have him saying post-Ephesian, post-Chalcedonian things, and we know Ephrem died much earlier than that.
Now, I'm going to make a comment on that, and it's easier to critique a position, and I really hope to unpack this, probably not this show, but in future shows. It's easier to make a knowledgeable sounding critique and go, oh, you just proved that, than actually prove something else. So I'm going to critique what you just said, just for the sake of the show. Like, again, the study of history, just like the study of our faith, right? Like, if you just look at your own heart, this is not an exact science. It's not, you make the volcano in 4th grade. You put baking soda and vinegar and it just works. This is not an exact science. So on that note, we have the issue, I think, of the same sort of analysis and approach that textual criticism of the scriptures, so that the German liberals in the 1800s brought to bear on how we look at these documents. Now, of course, there's scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman and stuff that say that's 100% correct. But let's say for a moment, well, maybe that's not the best approach. If we look at that, obviously the way we look at a lot of fathers is through that sort of lens. So, for example, with the Gospels, those who are aware will say, well, the earliest source in Christ's sayings is the Q source, right? And when we get references to stuff that may be pertaining to things that happened in the future or more developed theology, well, clearly that's some later writer, and then they date the Gospels according to that. Now, there's nothing from tradition or manuscripts, even, or archaeology that bears this out. It's all sort of these presuppositions of what we should expect from a certain writer at a certain time, and then it colors the conclusions that people make on dating. So, for example, clearly Gospel of John, according to Christian, because Irenaeus talks about had to be written last because it's more theological. And clearly, Gospel of Mark had to be before Matthew and Luke. So that means everything Matthew and Luke have in common is Q. That means when Mark doesn't make a lot of reference to the temple, but the Gospel of Matthew explicitly says, Christ says that the temple will be overturned. It had to be written after AD 70, even though we have, let's say, Luke, eternal details, because it has the same detail about the temple, eternal details that show it has dating before the year 70. But let's throw that all out the window. Clearly, it had to be dated after AD 70, they'll say. So let's talk about Ephrem, about your critique. And again, it's easier for me to poke holes than to prove the opposite of what you said. This is just so, again, we could have an appreciation of the difficulties in historical interpretation.
Sure.
That in with Ephrem, well, he didn't use the word mother God in this Psalter, so that must mean everything out of it must be an anachronism. Even though there's, like, for example, Rufinus and stuff will say, no, Origen used the word mother God. There is some credible evidence, because Rufinus lived, I would say the earlier of his career would have been during the later part of St. Ephrem the Syrian, or maybe they just missed each other. But Rufinus, right, was somewhat contemporary, and he was affirming that, no, we've got 3rd century sources to the usage of the word, of the term mother God. We have it from the prayer that we have, the Egyptian prayer that they dated archaeologically to the 3rd or 4th century, using the term Theotokos. So we already know historically it's not impossible. Doesn't mean he did, but it's not impossible for him to use that word. It's not impossible for him to have Christological concepts that only became more clearly delineated and made important in time. It's also not impossible whoever translated in Greek saw something and translated it clearer, like Rufinus did that with Origen, for example. We know as a fact, if you read the stuff from Origen that Rufinus translated, some of it's not even that bad. It's like, this is one translation of Origen's commentary in Romans from Rufinus, but flat out says that the Father, Son, Holy Spirit are one essence, and they're all, each person's eternal. I mean, it's perfectly true Trinitarian doctrine. So issues could even occur in translation, which means that doesn't mean something attributed to Ephrem the Syrian really isn't him. So there's difficulty, there's all probability. So let me now argue what you just said, and I'm going to then pass the microphone back to you. What other ways do we have of dating stuff other than eternal details? They should have not been using that word. They should have not been, it sounds different. There's other stuff, I'll just say, because contemporaries or people slightly afterwards will quote things. If it takes centuries for someone to quote something from St. Ephrem the Syrian, that lends credibility to the fact he probably didn't write, whoever attributed to St. Ephrem the Syrian didn't write it till decades, centuries, whatever later. So these are the considerations we have to make in historical analysis. Now, you're speaking of the importance of St. Ephrem. You're speaking of how the Greek and Syriac, you're becoming convinced, it sounds to me, that everything that's the Greek really wasn't originally St. Ephrem. Who do you think wrote the Greek stuff? Do you think it's one author? And do you have any other details about St. Ephrem's Christology and Mariology, which you think were relevant to the interview you just took part in with Dr. Bruck?
Sure. So first, I want to say I don't want to come off as not being clear regarding the Psalter. I didn't say because Mother of God is mentioned, therefore the whole thing is not genuine. No, each poem we take it and it's analyzed for what it says in itself. Now, regarding other criteria, we know it's not just Ephrem, but the inheritors of Ephrem, and then also those who preceded Ephrem from his same culture, from the same place he comes from. So, for example, one of the first Christian writings outside of the New Testament are the Odes of Solomon, written in Syriac. I think Ignatius of Antioch even quotes from them. So, and they are poems. And then throughout the early period, like the Acts of Thomas, although Gnostic, and the Song on the Pearl, which is not Gnostic, but in the Acts of Thomas and even earlier than the Acts of Thomas, also a song, a poem. And then it keeps going in this theme of Syriac poetry and what is emphasized, what is not emphasized, themes that go throughout all of them. So Ephrem belongs in this family. So if you and your family, you know your dad, you know how he talks, you know your mom, you know your brother, you know your sister, everybody, you know them. So we know how Ephrem talks from his family, especially the Syriacs of all people, know how he talks from his family. So when we hear him talking in a different language about things that he doesn't talk about, it's not his voice. We know it's not him. and we see in his successors of those who inherited his tradition, like Jacob of Saruj, and even Cyrilona, who was rumored to be his nephew, but nobody really knows. And then even the Church of the East, although they replaced him, you don't hear anybody who inherits Ephrem say the things that even when they expound on it. So, as you know, Jacob of Saruj was a non-Chalcedonian, but he never used Ephrem to prove it, one way or the other, right? So,
and you're saying if this stuff was there, he would have used it. It would have been too perfect.
Of course, or the Chalcedonians would have used it, right? Because there were Chalcedonian Syriacs up until very recently. There were Chalcedonian Syriacs. I want to say 17th century. I'm not 100% sure when that kind of was over, but the point is, it's not really disputed by scholarship, not just because of Brock, but even Robert Murray, who is he actually just passed away a year or two ago. He was a Roman Catholic priest. He was also, like Brock, one of the foremost Syriac scholars in the world. So these Ephrem being genuine in Syriac and sometimes Armenian is kind of the consensus view.
There is some danger of confirmation bias in that approach, but again, the study of history is probabilities. You have, like you said, Chalcedonian Syriac speakers engage in the same debates, not using certain sources. It lends credibility to the idea that they didn't know about it. You can't prove it, but again, it's all probabilities when you're trying to establish some sort of historical case.
Right.
And so let's talk a little about Dr. Sebastian Brock, because when I went to college, I was not studying theology other than Muslim theology when I did my master's degree. So I was not reading about Syrian history or anything like that. How many works would you say Dr. Sebastian Brock brought into English that didn't exist before St. Ephrem the Syrian? And what is his importance to those of us reading St. Ephrem the Syrian in the English language?
Well, I mean, I think I, as an American Syriac Orthodox person, am entirely indebted to him. Every person who's interested in the Syriac tradition and whose academic language is English is indebted to Sebastian Brock, because and he was recognized by His Holiness the Patriarch as a melpana of the church, a teacher of the church, because of his works. I don't know what we would do if I think I would then have to
get his phone number. Did he
I email him all the time whenever I have questions about it. And so he's humble enough to always reply to me. It's amazing.
What a blessing that is, right?
Yeah.
Because formed part of your formative stage intellectually, right? Last 10 years, I'm sure, to piece all the stuff together. And the guy that did it is alive and talking to you. You know?
How amazing is that? Yeah.
It is awesome.
Yeah.
So hard to overstate his importance when that's the guy who put it all into English, and that's how you're interacting with the material of the saint. I can't remember. I believe he's still actually engaged academically. There's because there's a lot of scholars who keep going until they die. He's 82, I think, and so he's still engaged. He's still doing things in this field, correct?
Yeah, he's retired, but like compared to before, he's retired. But he still has, he still oversees projects. He still has, like he said on the show, he's working on so many things still. I don't think when you have a passion like that, like he does, I don't think you can truly retire from the thing.
Yeah, he's dead now, and I actually pray for him, for his salvation. Dr. R.C. Sproul, who's a Reformed Protestant theologian and apologist when he was alive. And someone asked him, when are you going to retire from doing Ligonier and whatnot? And he said, retire? How do you retire from God's work? And then he gave this answer. He knew someone, he said. He was a great missionary, did all this stuff, and eventually just became an old guy. Couldn't do nothing, pretty much. Said he spent 8 hours a day praying. Because he said, well, that's the only thing I could do, and this is what I'll do for the church. I will pray. So he said, the man of God never stops doing God's work. Which pretty much that R.C. Sproul did his thing until he dropped dead. So he lived by that. And I do find interesting how that, again, Protestant missionary that only prayed, he became a monastic unintentionally. Like, he reinvented monasticism. It's evil when we do it, but when they do it, it's good. But so that aside, it's but that's why I could see that story and see that point and see how important it is. And I'd like to think, whenever they got the TikTok of 2065 or whatever they're doing in the future, we'll be doing this because this will be us when we're old being engaged doing God's work.
Yeah, for sure.
So let me ask you this question, and then I'm going to make some comments on a source that's ascribed to St. Ephrem. And then I want you to be my governor as I make comments on the recent show, because I had real issues, not with your questions, but with the questions and the reason why they're being asked. And so we're going to get to that in a bit. But let me ask this, which would be, I most of my reading, why haven't I done a show in a long time? I've been working 80 hours a week overtime. Most of my reading, I read on the computer, so it has to be open source. That doesn't mean I don't have books, but computers are easier for me to get around to all over the place than books are, okay? So that being said, I've read St. Ephrem, but the open source stuff that's on New Advent. So clearly that was not translated by Dr. Brock. Are you aware if that was a Syriac source or if that's one of the Greek words? So that is in Syriac.
Yeah, the ones on New Advent are. Yes.
All right, cool. Because now I'm going to get into my little reading of Ephrem. You have the broader reading, and I want you to kind of hone me and guide me and help me. Have you read the Nativity homilies from St. Ephrem? Okay. So we're going to be on the same page with this. So obviously you're going to have the greater expertise, but don't worry, the stuff I know more about than you do. So it's 2A Street. Maybe. I presume I know more about the Yankees anyway. So there's some things, maybe not anything else. But that being said, this issue has come up because my first time I even heard of Dr. Sebastian Brock, at least in memory, doesn't mean like something didn't come back at some point, whatever, and I just didn't care that much. But it was in a debate between Deacon Joseph Swayden and William Albrecht, and they were arguing about St. Ephrem. And if you're going to argue about St. Ephrem, you're going to have to argue about the guy who translated it and stuff like that. And so what came up was a very dismissive comment about a quotation in Hymn 11, where St. Ephrem, and you're saying, I believe this is the Syriac that's authentic, speaks of the Theotokos having second birth in the waters. Yeah. Now, this is important because it pertains to a larger theological topic of Mary's purification, which recently really due to the work of only 2 scholars in the West, and now there's been a Greek Orthodox guy who's jumped onto this, has taken on this whole new meaning, which seems to be completely alien to, I don't know, centuries of people in the church that were speaking the same exact thing, and this was totally off their radar, which is, of course, of interest to me intellectually, because I've looked at this topic as someone initially convinced of the modern scholarly viewpoint, and the more I read it and then read the fathers, said this modern scholarly viewpoint's not justifiable. Now, where St. Ephrem, the Syrian, fit in? Here's where he fits in. He fits in because he speaks of Mary's second birth, and in a source ascribed to him, which I'm going to argue is probably authentic, but it's in the translations in Greek. And how do I know? Because you can see Greek words in it. So it is a Greek translation at best, but it wasn't actually written originally in Greek.
I have the hymn you're talking about translated directly from the Syriac. Okay,
so when we get to that passage, you can read your translation, because I don't read directly from Syriac.
Yeah.
Unless God gives me the gift of tongues, so I don't think it's going to happen. So that being said, when we're reading those hymns, it becomes baptism occurs again and again and again. And the main thing that St. Ephrem the Syrian is interestingly focusing on is the same thing that Gregory Nazianzus also focuses on, which is when Christ was baptized, what happened? Right? What happened when Christ was baptized? And the answer is he purified the waters. In a sense, when Christ went into the waters, that in a metaphysical sense baptized everybody and made baptism possible. So that's a Greek theologian, but we see this in these nativity homilies from a Syriac theologian, which shows this was something obviously the whole church had to understand. Some guy in the hinterlands versus some guy, in the metropolitan areas, the important parts of the ecumene. Right? If they have this in common, and they lived at the same time, it's got to be pretty spread, a pretty spread out doctrine that people acknowledge.
Well, Ignatius of Antioch.
I'm sorry?
Ignatius of Antioch also explicitly says that. He says that when Christ was baptized, he purified the waters.
I can't remember. Do you remember? I actually totally don't remember that. Which epistle is that?
I have the source. Let me give it to you.
Well, we'll look into that. While you're doing that, I'm going to read now the nativity homilies because I want to unpack. It's easy to say, no, it doesn't. Dr. Brock, I just said St. Brock. We'll have to see if that happens. Dr. Brock says that doesn't mean that in that passage. Okay. Yeah. Now, we're going to talk about he was asked about this and he did not give the answer that he was portrayed that he supposedly gave. But that aside, what does baptism mean in these nativity homilies? Because this is how we understand the doctrine of Mary's purification according to St. Ephrem. This is not to show I'm going to do it, but the doctrine of purification is somewhat broader than Ephrem's treatment. But that being said, I'm going to read from hymn 1. I'm reading open source, so I can't give you a paragraph. You could click Control F and find the words that way if you want.
Okay.
So in hymn 1, it says, "Earth which the flood had swallowed up, in silence cried to her Lord. He came down and opened baptism, and men were drawn by it to heaven." All right, just like I was describing. Seth and Enoch, Canaan, 2 were surnamed sons of God. For the Son of God they looked, that they by grace might be his brethren. But little short of 1,000 years did Methuselah live. He looked for the Son who makes the heirs of life that never ends. Grace itself, in hidden mystery, was beseeching on their behalf that their Lord might come in their age and fill up their shortcomings. All right, so I'm not going to unpack this too much because we're going to keep reading, but we could see that the baptism, to use the term of Dr. Father Capps, is a negative purification. It's correcting something that is some sort of fault, a shortcoming here. All right, so when Christ purified the waters, it gave a positive purification. It negatively purified. Again, this is Dr. Capps' categories of thought. Everyone else who is baptized into Christ. Clear the people named here were Old Testament, so this would have to have been baptism by the Spirit and not literal water baptism. Now I'm going to read hymn number 2. It says, and again, you can click Control F if you want to find this stuff. "Glory be to him who was baptized and drowned our iniquity in the deep, and choked him that choked us. Let us glorify with all our mouths the Lord of all creatures." So again, we're seeing Christ went to the waters. Like you see in iconography, I presume your iconography is the same. It shows that kind of like sea dragon when Christ is baptized in the Jordan.
Yes.
So he cleanses the waters when he's baptized. This is something all us Orthodox believe. And that, in effect, drowns our iniquity when we're baptized. So we're seeing this negative purification, our iniquity. This is important because when we're looking at the word baptism, we have to understand it according to the context of the hymns, because this is the source we're dealing with. Now, this is where you're going to be super helpful, so Deacon Man. I'm going to read hymn 11. You probably know at least the area I'm talking about. So, but you can click Control F where I'm reading a New Advent. It starts with "you are not," because it's Mary speaking to Jesus.
Got it.
Mary says, "You are not so the Son of Man that I should sing unto you a common lullaby, for your conception is new and your birth is marvelous." I'm going to stop there for a second. So for the interpreter, you're like, okay, she talk about birth or conception. It's, to be honest, it's conflated. We don't know from this passage, okay?
Yeah.
"Without the Spirit who shall sing to you, a new muttering of prophecy is hot within me. How shall," so again, prophecy is she's asking for the Holy Spirit to give her words to speak in this hymn. She continues, "How shall I call you a stranger to us who is from us? Should I call you son? Should I call you brother? Husband, should I call you? Lord, should I call you? O child that gave your mother a second birth from the waters." Okay, so again, we have to think of what baptism means. I'm going to continue, and then I'm going to hand this over to Deacon Dan for a moment. "For I am your sister of the house of David. The father is bold. Again, I am your mother because of your conception, and your bride am I because of your sanctification, your handmaid and your daughter, from the blood and water wherewith you have purchased me. The Son of the Most High came and dwelt in me, and I became his mother." All right, so she's talking about, again, conception. "And by a second birth I brought him forth." So did he bring me forth by the second birth? Because he put his mother's garments on, and she clothed her body with his glory. All right, so this is why I've made the interpretation that the Annunciation is the second birth that St. Ephrem's talking about. And only a few decades later, St. Leo the Great, in his Nativity homilies, speaks of the Annunciation as also Mary's baptism. So this is not some sort of, we have to look at this contextually in history. But I'm going to stop for a moment because we have someone who's got a translation right from Syriac. So what defects are the translation that I'm using to make my interpretations? And give me any insight you have so far on what we read.
Nothing, no significant defects here. Nothing worth going over the other translation with, in my opinion. And just, I don't want to get off topic. I just want to give you the source, and we'll get back onto this. That Ignatius quote is in his letter to the Ephesians 18. That's where you could find where he says Christ purified the waters when he was baptized. Ignatius and answer.
Wait, repeat that, because my brain heard Ephesians 18, which couldn't be right, and all comprehension stopped. So
no, that's right. In his letter to the Ephesians 18.
You're talking about Ignatius. All right, you know what? And guys, just during question and answers, we're going to look at that because that's going to be fun, and I'm always open to learning even while live. So I'm going to now read hymn 16. Because you could actually start now inferring St. Ephrem the Syrian's doctrine of original sin, which is important because this is how I started reading Ephrem the Syrian, which, again, nowhere close to you. I'm not even going to compare it. I read it so that way I could respond intelligently to something that's it's not like I imbibed in him. I've imbibed in Augustine. I've imbibed, like I said, in Ignatius, though I forgot stuff apparently. I have not imbibed in Ephrem. I'm not going to pretend that I did. But let me read hymn 16. He says, he, which is now back to Jesus, the one who purified the waters, he was baptized for Adam's sin and buried for Adam's death. He rose and raised Adam into glory. Blessed be he who came down and clothed him and went up. Through your birth, though your birth had sufficed for Adam's sons as for Adam, Almighty One who became a babe, in your birth anew, you have begotten me. O pure one who was baptized, let your washing wash away our filth. O living one who was buried, may we gain life in your death. I will praise all of you in him that fills all. Why do I read this? Because now we got to start connecting these words from these nativity hymns to try to realize what he's saying about Mary. For one, we see baptism delivers us from Adam's sin. That's not my words. That's St. Ephrem the Syrian. We see that in hymn 11, he said, your handmaid and your daughter from the blood and water wherewith you purchased me. Look at hymn 16, where it says, from your birth and from your death. So we see that connection. Water would be, again, the baptism and initiation. This is connecting the birth. And death would be the crucifixion that connects the blood. So the same categories in 16 are mirrored in hymn 11, and Mary is prescribing it to herself. This is so important for the interpreter. Again, history is not a perfect science. This is not like, I guarantee the volcano is going to work with baking soda and vinegar. And just so you know, if you use white vinegar, it looks a lot more lame than the red wine vinegar. All right, if you're going to make your own volcano with baking soda and vinegar. History is an imperfect science, but we're speaking of probabilities. When we read hymn 11 and we see this connection between birth and resurrection, we see this, begotten actually, so it would be annunciation and and death on the cross and water and blood. There's a parallel here that we have to pay attention. When Mary speaks of, because we see in hymn 16, wash away our filth, she says, "O child that gave your mother a second birth from the waters," right? So are we speaking of Mary being washed away from filth? Some people say, you're going too far. You can't say that about Mary. Be honest, I want to say that. That sounds wrong. But now I'm going to read one more thing, and then I'm going to give it to Subdeacon Daniel. I'm going to read from Ephrem. This is from Greek that's been translated to Russian, which has been translated to English. So I'm not going to pretend it's a perfect translation. It's what I could get my hands on. All right. It's from a it's not a poem. From what it appears to me, it's just a homily or some sort. It's called A Word on Heretics, paragraph 19. Here's what it says. But I'm going to argue, just like you said, there's Greek sources that appear to be from the same family and Greek sources that don't. Here's what Ephrem says. Here's what he says. Paragraph 19. Pearls come from unclean animals. So also Christ was born out of a nature that had been subjected to impurity and in need of being cleansed by God's visitation. Even as the lightning penetrates all matter, even as the lightning illuminates hidden things, so also Christ does cleanse the inner hidden nature. He also cleansed the virgin and then was born. The word could also be purified. It's just the translation I'm using. Thus, having shown that where is Christ, there is purity in all its power. He cleansed the virgin first, having prepared her with the Holy Spirit, whereafter the cleansed womb is able to conceive him. So here, why it's such a powerful passage is because I don't feel comfortable with this, but again, we have to accept the saints, historically speaking, from what they say. He compares Mary to like an oyster, which is unclean to the Jews. Pearls, like Jesus, come from an unclean animal. So also Christ was born out of a nature that had been subjected to impurity. Now, just for those listening, both Subdeacon Daniel and I believe that Mary never sinned. We believe she's all holy. When we speak of these things, we believe, there'll be liberal historians that will say wrongly, but we believe that the saints that comment on these things also believe that stuff, because we believe the church has always taught this. So we have to understand what we're reading within the context of Mary being all holy. Mary never sinned. So I don't want anyone to be scandalized by this, because this is a very narrow intellectual topic, which I covered elsewhere, pertains to Mary having original sin, but not sinning, having a post-lapsarian soul and body that must corrupt, that must turn away from passions, that did not voluntarily assume them like Jesus Christ. So this is important for addressing a very narrow intellectual topic, not for Mary, how holy Mary is, because in a sense, Mary's all holiness is look how holy she was when she was born in the same state we were. So that aside, I want to connect something from paragraph 19 from A Word on Heretics to what we read and what we agree is real Ephrem, which is one, we see the washing, the cleansing, the second birth, your consent, where Mary says in hymn 11 that, I'm trying to find it, by a second birth I brought him, for so did he bring me forth by the second birth. Because he put on his mother's garments on, she clothed her body with his glory. So I'm now going to make a stretch, which would be this, that I think that's a reference to Mary now being capable right? By that grace, by that second birth, being capable of having the incarnation. Because again, she's a created being, and at that time, the hypostatic union's occurring. So this is a big deal. So I think when we read these things side by side, it becomes extremely clear. If it's not the same writer, it's from the same family, same school of thought, disciple, someone who read a bunch of from whatever. Lack of anything in the manuscript records saying otherwise, we could, I think, safely say this is St. Ephrem. And reading just internally from the Nativity homilies, when we look at what baptism is, that Christ was baptized for Adam's sin and buried for Adam's death, that we see how that Mary assumes those same categories to herself, that it's clear that the birth, the second waters, is by a second birth I brought him forth, right? By a second birth she conceived him. The second birth is the Annunciation. It's a purification Mary received at the Annunciation that later Byzantine hymnography speaks of, other Byzantine fathers, and here is proof of a Syriac father who believed the same thing. So those are my comments on that. Poke holes, say whatever you want. The microphone is yours, so Deacon Dan.
Okay, so yesterday on the show, Sebastian Brock he prioritized taking the Syriac tradition and taking Ephrem's poems for what they are saying, not imposing on them the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, or the opposite, to disprove the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception.
Can't disprove something that didn't exist.
So this is not what was occurring in the mind of the poet, right?
Yes.
They weren't thinking about this stuff. So if you want my opinion about that last poem, I'm not familiar with it. If I had to guess, just because of the amount of times it's in the fourth language now, I think it is Russian.
Well,
so they're
yes, fourth language. That's in English.
So
I'm not pretending it's a perfect translation.
I don't know. We have very, very few homilies from Ephrem left. Most of the things we have are poems. So if I had to guess, I would guess it's not, but who cares what I would guess? So I actually I want to ask Brock actually about the quote. So if you can send that to me later.
By all means. Yeah, I'll send you after the show.
Okay. And then regarding the doctrine though. So like Brock said, Ephrem is very he prioritizes to the person who's reading his poems, don't inquire too much about things that are not meant to be inquired into. So
Amen.
Yeah. So I think if I remember I don't remember whose question it was. One of the three of us that was on the show yesterday with Brock, we asked the question, and then
you don't remember your own questions?
I remember mine. I want to throw myself in the group. It's okay. And he replies saying, actually, Ephrem taught not to ask about such things. So I wouldn't make the connection of a negative purification with in the context of Mary's, which it is a baptism and it is a rebirth, absolutely to Ephrem. There's no way around it. It's 100% a baptism and a rebirth of Virgin Mary. She was clothed with the robe of glory.
It pertains to Adam's sin, according to hymn 16.
Yeah. So did the hymn explicitly say that in hymn 16?
I'm going to read it again. Hymn 16. He was baptized for Adam's sin and buried for Adam's death.
Yeah. Sorry. So what I meant by that is Mary's baptism and rebirth.
It just says second birth, correct?
Yeah. So what we have to do then in Mary's case, because Mary, we don't have an actual situation with water here, like as me and you.
Yeah, we have the Annunciation.
Yeah. So in Mary's case, then it would be on the person who was interested in the topic to read the works that scholars have put forth regarding Ephrem, and not just Ephrem, but other Syriac tradition regarding the Annunciation specifically. And
Yes, I agree.
there's a work by Robert Murray on the specific topic. There's multiple works by Brock on the specific topic. There's a book called Luminous Eye. I think I sent it to you, by the way. Chapter 5, maybe a few months ago, not in regards to this. I just randomly send you things. So chapter 5. If I didn't, I'll send it to you again. So in this, it talks about, the whole thing is about Mary's acquiring of this robe of glory at the Annunciation. In Ephrem's commentary on the Gospels regarding this event, he says, he talks about a purification, not of Mary as an individual, but of creation, of which Mary is a part. So
Yes.
Mary exemplified creation by putting on this robe of glory, as Brock said yesterday, in the ideal way, as opposed to us who, when we put it on at baptism, now we have this process of keeping it unstained until we truly put it on at the end, the eschaton, I think he called it. Whereas Mary put it on in the way that we will put it on eventually. So I don't know if we can take from Ephrem's poem any definitive understanding that she was purified from sin. I don't think he intends for us to take that away. He's not trying to get that across to us. So it's not it's not for him a matter of, was she conceived with this sin or was she not conceived with this sin? Was she purified of it? For him, he's not thinking that way. He's not trying to. So for us, it's going to be really difficult. We're going to try to reach here and there. Like for example, you are looking at the way in the Syriac understanding of Christ himself being baptized and what that does for us, which is true. That's absolutely true. This is what Christ does for us when he was baptized. He was baptized for our sake. I don't know if you also saw the original Sin show that we did after the Sebastian Brock show. I actually talk about that whole.
No, I saw the one with Father Whiteford.
So right after the Brock show, we did another show about original sin, and for the stuff I was saying was everything that you're saying about Christ being baptized and what that does for us. And I go to the Syriac baptism rite and everything. So with Christ being baptized, everything you're saying is true. But we cannot take this and then put it onto the Mary thing and say this is what Ephrem meant. We have to take what Ephrem said about Mary, not just from this poem, but from all the poems, just like the scholars did for us, and then we see what they're saying. Robert Murray explicitly says, he says, Roman Catholics try to implicate the Immaculate Conception here, but they can't do that. And he's a Roman Catholic priest, and he throws that out. So
to quote someone, he'll say to this situation, "Wow, wow."
So, and here's another thing: is we all went into the show and left the show with Brock, thinking that the Immaculate Conception is not found here, but also is it against the Immaculate Conception? And we went away saying it's also not against it because the writer is not thinking about that. So I don't think anybody went away from the show thinking, yes, this proved the Immaculate Conception or something like that. That would just be ridiculous. And I'm pretty sure nobody went away from the show.
I'm going to briefly make this comment because I see this more broadly because I see this topic happen again and again and again among other fathers, right? If I'll disclose my own weaknesses as an interpreter, I always go in presuming they agree unless I have overwhelming evidence that you can't make them agree, right? That is my exegetical bias when I read the works of saints. And so when I read this, of course, that's going to be my, like I said, that's going to be the kind of bias I'm going to have going in, which could be bad. But I want to say this as well. which would be if we just took how baptism and second birth is treated in those hymns alone, and didn't take in our presuppositions of what we think about Mary, and just said, this is what he says baptism is and what it does and what Christ did. And here's what Mary said about herself, about her being baptized. The simplest answer would be that baptism was no different than what baptism is being discussed in all the other hymns. That's the simplest answer. It doesn't mean it's right.
Right.
But the reason why I think the simplest answer is correct is because other saints talk about the same moment, the Annunciation. They talk about the same concept, purification. We have someone also called Saint Ephrem writing about it elsewhere, and it's very clearly what is, and I don't like the term, negative purification, meaning there is a shortcoming that's correct, right? What that shortcoming is, I don't think the saints, to be perfectly honest, give a completely uniform answer. I know that's teasing the heck out of people, but here's the broad spectrum of what it may be. Just utter human capacity to have God in you, right, at the very basic level. One step beyond that would be essentially just being part of fallen creation and now having creation that's not fallen in you. One step beyond that would be, and we have this, for example, in St. Ambrose and St. Gregory the Great, an actual purification of the mind. Like your mind had to be totally dead focused on the right thing when this is occurring. This is big. We do this in the liturgy. We pray before the liturgy that we have this when we consecrate. So it's a very similar concept. So it's also speaking to, lack of a better term, we don't want to call it moral defect, but maybe moral imperfection due to the fall. That's like a less meaning-sounding thing. And so it's somewhere within that spectrum of that. Because again, St. Ephrem doesn't specifically speak of, like we see St. Gregory the Great, a cleansing from concupiscence or something like that. So we can't say that's definitely what he's talking about. But we do see a purification from shortcoming, whatever that is. And clearly and from sin, because we see that in hymn 16. That doesn't mean he thought Mary sinned. That doesn't mean he believed Mary had original guilt. These are concepts he did not, one, original guilt, probably he wasn't trained to sinning as, so he wouldn't even have a concept of that idea. And two, he believed in the sinlessness of Mary. So that we could say. But you are now starting to talk about the show yesterday, and now we just covered, I think, Ephrem, my view, your more nuanced view, and probably more intelligent. I want to make comments in the show, and I need you to reel me in, because obviously I was kicked off the show, so this guy can't be unbiased, right? I mean, come on, this guy can't be unbiased, So that's why I said, let me put someone on the show, who's a really good guy, who actually knew the scholar there, knew about him, actually read him. Let me bring him on to reel me back and to perhaps correct my comments, because here are my impressions. Here's why it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Not because someone disagreed with me. What rubbed me the wrong way is it really sounded to me like a kind of old person who's intelligent but wasn't preparing for an apologetic, perchance. He could give you broad answers about things he translated, things he studied. What he wasn't privy to were arguments between me, Elijah Yassi, and in some sort of indirect way, because he never debated me. Well, no, we had that one round table, William Albrecht. And so they're asking questions, purposely trying to get Dr. Brock to prove their position. Dr. Brock, throughout this conversation, isn't, and then they keep asking these questions, these probing questions, with that in mind. Here's why I care about that. We have to have a certain level of intellectual honesty. And so when in this show where I said, you have a certain interpretation of what's an authentic view of St. Ephrem, what's not an authentic view, and I personally even gave the pro and con, and I said, and giving a con is easier. So that's me saying, listen, it sounds like I'm critiquing, but we have to be open to the fact that this doesn't solve the question, it doesn't totally disprove the viewpoint. So when we interview an academic, we have to be careful to ask the right questions, which you did because you read his work, not to ask questions that pertain to arguments you've been having on Facebook or whatever else. The reason why I'm even going to get into, because I don't want to get too into personal stuff, is I want to get into stuff that maybe misportrayed Dr. Brock's research in St. Ephrem. So this is now the comments I'm going to give. It's going to be on those notes. Please interrupt me if I'm saying anything out of line, or if you just think you're getting Dr. Brock wrong or you're getting the interview wrong. You're part of it, obviously. So I'm going to start making some comments. Now, Dr. Brock, in the beginning of the interview, said something interesting. And he said, the way Mary was portrayed in Syriac, and this is now a direct quote, is not unique, but more frequent than other Syriac writers. There's a reason why when we look at Mariology in the Syriac, we're looking at St. Ephrem. But like what you said, I'm thinking that there's a whole family here. And obviously, this is the context that Dr. Brock is looking at. You know, it's not unique. This is how the whole family talks. You know, in my family, I grew up in an Italian household. We talk with our hands. That's how we talk. You cut my hands off with a speech impediment. So it's not. This would not be unique on Christmas Eve. And he actually said with Ephrem, there isn't anything unique, which I found to be an interesting quote. So someone who's trying to find a quotation that it's like, oh, this shows he said this to Dr. Brock, the expert, there's nothing unique here. I'll say that Ephrem wasn't overtly typological, which I actually find interesting because this discussion of second birth in the waters and how that purified all the waters, I wouldn't say that's typological, but there's definitely this metaphysical, spiritual aspect to it. But let me ask you to interrupt. Would you say the Syriac school of theology was kind of like the Antiochene school, a little more literalistic? That, you know, it wasn't typological?
Yeah, it's very biblical, I think is the word. Right?
There we go. Right, literalistic makes it sound bad or somehow not intelligent, and biblical makes it sound legit. So yes, both terms would be correct. Now, William Albrecht then responds, you know, that's something I'm not aware of, and which again, when you take someone's research and you portray this is what he said and it's special and it shows that he knew it, you know, and then to walk back the statement, I think at least this is where it's saying, oh, I misspoke, or you know what, I interpreted it wrongly, or I got a little too excited and I made a statement. You have to be willing to say things like that. Then Elijah Yassi, who I had on the show, and I'm sure I'll be writing comments to this, started asking questions, obviously not happy with this conversation with me, because every single question he asked was essentially about trying to disprove things I've spoken about on YouTube or written on my website. Now, at least I'm happy that he learned a little something. He said, I know it's really anachronistic for us to ask, that's a direct quotation, about the Immaculate Conception. Because in my show with Mr. Yassi about the Damascene's homilies, he seemed to be fighting pretty hard, like, oh, well, maybe she didn't die, and stuff where we're trying to take this view that he really had this view of the Immaculate Conception, which, again, the doctrine didn't exist. So there's no way he even conceived of it, let alone the categories of thought that make the doctrine work. But that's, again, another matter. But then he asks a very pointed question, trying to get a response, something along the lines of this. He says, if the doctrine states, because he didn't have the doctrine, if the doctrine states at no point did the dominion of the devil ever touch the Theotokos, and she was completely pure in every point of her existence, you know, is that true according to St. Ephrem, or did it start at the Annunciation? And the response to Dr. Brock was that there's no, he said, this is Mary, there, he said, I'm writing it down, there's no implications of the Immaculate Conception. All the Syriac fathers understand, all that the Syriac fathers understand is that Mary was the most suitable and most holy, and from that point of view, she was immaculate. It's similar, but not quite the same. So this was after Dr. Brock said, like, listen, you know, it's just not there, so I don't know how to really intelligently answer this question, but it's just not quite the same. There's things that are similar. And why is this important? Because when you're trying to ask a question to a scholar saying, you know, what was that second birth, right? This would have been a legitimate question. Dr. Brock, hymn 11, what was that second birth, being that these other hymns talk about baptism and this is what it is? And then he goes, here's my opinion, or I haven't read that in a while. I didn't translate that. I'll have to get back to you, whatever his answer is. But that was not the question asked to him. The question asked to him was, I know the Immaculate Conception is not real, but, it wasn't real to him, but here's what is the Immaculate Conception. Do you think he would have believed it if he understood these concepts? And that's really not a suitable question to the scholar. It's too pointed. It's too loaded. And I want to bring that out because when we do these shows and intellectual topics, I hope the audience understands that, okay, here's a guy with a master's degree in social studies education. I am not a scholar in Greek. I am not a theologian. I'm not a priest. I'm none of those things. We should be viewing this as sort of an intellectual hobby of sorts that hopefully gets us reading the Fathers closer and engaging spiritually with these works. That's the goal, right? Now, Subdeacon Daniel Pekish is actually a clergyman. He's what would they call subdeacons? They call minor clergy. What's the term?
Yeah, minor orders.
Yeah, he's a minor order. But ultimately, for those of us, you haven't finished seminary yet, right?
No.
Yeah. So and again, my master's degree, it's not like my master's degree was in, Near Eastern Studies. No, it was a social studies education, So I know how to read academics because that's what I did, but it doesn't make me the expert, the be-all, end-all in every topic. So we have to be careful when we go to web shows or these blogs and think that, these are really high-level academics, because we're not. Sometimes we could be right. There's people that are academics and all that could be right about stuff over and against the academics. There's the age of coronavirus. We see that happen every day. So I'm not saying this to say everything on the show or Reason Theology or every blog is wrong. That's not the point. The point is we have to be careful not to view it as overly academic when it's not. All right. And that's important to me because I have an interest in academia. I want people to engage with things as intellectually and honestly as possible. In fact, I probably got a little bit of trouble in my own church about something like this because I think it's important we read all things that way. All right. So if it's a web show and we're asking questions, we want to ask questions that are going to help the audience get a better idea. Now, I probably didn't even do that in this own show. So this is why I offer this constructive criticism. It's not that I'm without sin in this regard. Maybe something Dan is, but I'm not without sin in this regard. But we have to be especially careful with an academic. It's not like two guys who know each other on Facebook having a conversation. With academics, we got to be especially careful. God bless William Albrecht. God bless Mike Lofton. They get some really good guests. And so too much has been given, much is required. And I hope that's taken in the most positive way to improve the content of that show. Because, again, I don't have any first-hand way of adding that sort of input anymore. In that show, it continues. That I want to make this comment, actually, because this was made in response to me, that William Albrecht made a big deal. I think it was a Syriac father. He found the word Immaculate Conception. And he goes, here, look, it proves the doctrine because the words were there in a Syriac father, which I find actually very interesting. But here we just had a Syriac expert say the word immaculate is similar, but not quite the same. So we got to be careful when looking at words, not presuming they mean what they mean to us in the 21st century, myself included, looking at the word purify. The word purification or cleanse has such a negative connotation, right? It's like what you do to dirt, that you could read it wrongly and then think of something as saint as blasphemous when it's not. So that's very important. The same happens even with the word concupiscence, because it has such this negative connotation and has a slightly broader usage in the fathers, including Augustine. Now, he's asked, William Albrecht asks, Mary's baptism, remission of sins, passions, concupiscence, which actually is a good question, in my opinion. It's straightforward. It's something, maybe if the hymn was referenced, Dr. Brock could have gave a better answer. And Dr. Brock says, I really don't remember. He's like, but I am aware of that sometimes baptism is not a remission of sins, because, right, there's no, especially Mary, no inherited guilt. There's no specific sin. She's forgiven. Keyword sins, right? There's a plural here. But it can be understood in different ways. It's a movement into new life, right? Kind of like I think you were referring to. It could be this idea, like Dr. Brock said, of this intellectual purification. And again, this is consistent with St. Ambrose and St. Gregory the Great, who speak about her passions or concupiscence, I forget the word, being purified by the spirit that overshadowed her. All right. So again, that's intellectual, because none of us believe Mary imbibed in lustful thoughts or anything like that. So this is not what we're talking about. So we have to see these things as consistent. But this was, I believe, a too nuance of an answer that those who weren't taking that broader view would have picked up on, whether it been William Albrecht or the audience. So that's something I wanted to point out. What would be more important would be to try to get Dr. Brock to speak specifically on the nativity homilies when he can, because that is actually the point at issue. And quite frankly, he's just giving an opinion, and his opinion's really not inconsistent. So we got to be careful not to say, oh, this proves my view over against his other dudes. Elijah then asks, again, this is why it's important when we have academics to ask the right questions. He asks a Syriac scholar about the word purification and its meaning, but all the debates about what the Greek fathers meant in it. You know, it's like, well, what did the Greek fathers mean about it? And granted, Elijah didn't say the word Greek, but when it's a Syriac scholar, you have to say the Greek fathers appear to have this view of the word purification, or it's debated. What is the Syriac view of the word purification within that context? That's a better question. Dr. Brock, because again, you know, he was not counting on people trying to trap him into proving their worldview, said he's guessing the Annunciation was not moral cleansing, but intellectual. Guessing is his words. But then he says later, if you listen to his response, it could be both moral and intellectual. And he says, without the precise context, he can't give an answer. So that is, quite frankly, the only answer you could give, because it could be either of those things. So I wanted to make the record clear, because that's a phenomenal scholar. I didn't bring anything up with you, Subdeacon Daniel, because you didn't ask anything wrong. You asked questions from the vantage point of someone that actually engaged with his scholarship, that was speaking to him not to try to win some sort of argument online. And that's why I started this show with making a more academic background through you, St. Ephrem. I gave you my reading. We talked about where we might agree, disagree. And I wanted to then caution people that listen to the show that we got to be careful with the answers, thinking they validate your viewpoint, because all of us go in wanting to see what our itching ears want to hear. That's to all of us, includes me. We need to be open to being wrong. And also, when we have an academic at that level, we have to be careful to ask the right questions, because otherwise you're not going to get really fruitful responses. So that's my response to the show. I think we did a lot over St. Ephrem. Let me give you some closing comments, and then we're going to do audience questions.
You got it. I just want to make a quick point and then address everything you said about connecting the dots in the Syriac tradition for what they say regarding baptism and the efficacy of baptism, and then regarding Mary's baptism at the Annunciation. I understand that this is the rational, the rational way to think, and the Western way to think, and us being educated as Western rationalists, it's easy to connect those dots. But if that is not what the poet is intending to do, so then it should not be done in this case. All I'm saying is be careful when making the connection there. Try to, if you want to know the Syriac views on Mary, so read what they say about Mary and the Annunciation, about Mary, not the baptism's efficacy for us, but about Mary specifically. And then regarding Elijah, I just want to say, and this is just for background knowledge, he and I go back, we're from the same community here. We go back before all of this. we've actually been talking about Mary in the Syriac tradition, me and him back and forth for at least 5 years. Wow, at least 5 years, if not more. He we were actually using Saint Jacob of Suruj a lot. There's a book I read. It's great. It's he wrote it. It's like $14 on Amazon or something. It's called Jacob of Suruj on the Mother of God. SVS, Saint Vladimir's Press, published it. It's great. The whole thing is just Jacob of Suruj on the Mother of God. So I asked Brock about Jacob's Mariology, and he said Jacob is Ephrem. It's like Kobe to Michael Jordan, how he tried to copy him with everything. It's the same thing with Jacob to Ephrem, and he just kind of keeps going. Where Ephrem left off, Jacob takes it more and then pushes it. So that's Jacob. Now there is a poem. I can't remember if we brought it up yesterday or not, but where Ephrem actually says explicitly purified her mind. And I think the answer was the purification is more one of understanding God's will, and to where, and then it was a growing process of holiness that Mary continued on. For example, she's not understanding how it's possible for her to be pregnant without a man. And then when she sees later on, Jesus is 12 years old. Where were you? She thought he got lost or something. So it's a growing process of holiness and understanding the will of God continually in her life. Now, there was something you said about regarding the Greek fathers before the show went on. I think, or if it was a day before, I can't remember. I had told Elijah that Brock actually went from being an expert in Greek to Syria. He kind of made the jump. So it could be, I don't know, but it could be that's what he was thinking, since he can do that with the Greek too. Let me just ask him. I'm not sure.
Because during the actual interview, I forget what the context of it was, but he did actually say he did not have such a background in what other fathers were saying. And he was commenting for the
yeah,
tradition.
It's his passion. So again, there's so much on this. If anyone is interested, I'm always available. Like if you guys want sources, PDFs, whatever. I don't even know if that's legal, but I'm not sure. I have all this stuff, and I want everybody to know about the Syriac tradition. So I'm willing to share.
And before, because we'll do like official plugs and stuff, but do you have a website? Because I only know you from Facebook.
I don't have one. Maybe I should make one. I don't know.
Something to think about. Let me tell you, you're one of my favorite commentators online in the small little world that I revolve around and care about. So
thank you, Craig.
So being that we're ready for audience questions, I'm going to bring up this one. I'll let you answer first because I have an opinion. And if you need time, I'll screen share it. Is the filth mentioned in hymn 16 linked to what St. Ephrem says in hymn 2 when he quotes Zechariah 33 referring to our filthiness? I'm going to try to screen share as we talk.
Okay, I have it open too. He said hymn 2. Is that right?
Hymn 2, yeah. You could just Control F 3 and you'll find it.
Okay.
And I'm putting it up there for our guest, or whatever you guys that watch. And I'm going to make that bigger.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. So for Ephrem, there is this, and you will see this. Then, if you look into the Syriac tradition about baptism and clothing imagery in general, it's huge from the beginning of Syriac tradition, such as the Odes of Solomon that I mentioned before, throughout, and the Song on the Pearl, and then Ephrem, and all of these writers that come. clothing imagery is such a big deal, especially in baptism. There's a lot of history there that we put on the robe of glory. We put on Jesus, like St. Paul says, you who have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. And it's absolutely referring to that we and like Craig mentioned earlier with Ignatius of Antioch, he said Gregory, but also Ignatius of Antioch, by his baptism he purified the water. So now the water doesn't purify him; he purifies the water. But because of that, now this water purifies us. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, I want to add this comment. When we see there, it says, "Glory be to him on high who mixed his salt in our minds, his leaven in our souls. His body became bread to quicken our deadness." So, right, he not only gave our corrupting bodies, right, new birth, we're going to have glorified bodies in Christ. He also redeemed our minds and souls. So this is why we got to be so careful when we see the word filthiness and be like, oh, that means Mary was thinking filthy things. No, that's not what it means if we're speaking of Mary's baptism being essentially the same. But also when it's a reference to her, let's say her mind, that, God was purifying her mind. And we, again, St. Ambrose and Gregory the Great, when they're actually saying purified from concupiscence. It's not saying that Mary was thinking lustful things, but that baptism, that grace was identical to what we have when we are baptized. So that's what we're seeing here. Now, again, this requires an orthodox soteriology where we have to live up to our baptisms. To quote Archbishop Michael, this is OCA, Bishop of New York, New Jersey, he said, baptism is not magic. It has to be lived out in a lifetime of faith. All right? So your mind is purified when you are baptized, but the quote, New Martyr Denis Sizoyev, you must preserve your salvation. You must preserve your pure mind, and which you don't do all the time. So you must repent when you don't do that. So this requires an orthodox soteriology. I think the West is, and this is actually more bashing Protestants. So I'm not trying to bash them, but just trying to speak in generalities because this is a show where you can't solve all the world's problems in a few minutes. That we're so obsessed with debts and we're so obsessed with right and wrong that we need to have this more nuanced soteriological view, because this is what the fathers had in common, because they were not debating the issues that we're debating now and care about now, because those were not the controversies. But yes, I would agree, like what you said, hymn 16 is obviously connected with this, because I think every reference to baptism is a reference to the same thing, because every hymn's about it. About to use the word frickin'. So we're going to keep going and look for more questions. And if it's not,
actually, can I say something real quick?
Go right ahead. Yeah.
Regarding also, I want to say about Elijah. I think you mentioned the Dormition. So this is very clear in the Syriac tradition that Mary died and then God rose her and assumed her into heaven. I think he believes that from what him and I have talked about. I'm like 99.99900% sure he believes that. And also we've discussed these questions about what happened at the Annunciation, what happened before and after, and what the change was. And when I say we discussed it, I mean we discussed it according to what Ephrem said and what the Syriac fathers said, that as them being the authority. And we went away from the conversations, again, 5 years ongoing, maybe more, coming that we don't really think that it necessarily has to be something that is conflicting with his Mariology or with mine. And if I feel like it's compatible and even reconcilable of maybe the East and the Western way of thinking about this. I think that for him, he can totally accept that at the Annunciation, she put on the robe of glory, and then for us too. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to throw that in. I was thinking about it.
Now, be honest. Do you consider yourself ecumenist of sorts, or tending towards reconciliation? I know you said that you believe Chalcedon to be essentially correct. So, do you think that may also color your interpretation?
I don't believe Chalcedon is correct. No,
Okay.
I wouldn't want any. I wouldn't want to ever any of the Oriental Orthodoxy to in any agreement to ever accept Chalcedon. But um, I don't think I'm an ecumenist. I believe the Oriental Orthodox is church is the one true church. At the same time, I love I love my brothers in the other churches, and I want unity to happen because I love them, but not at the expense of truth.
And try not to get a big head. But that's why I took you as the ecumenist type, because you're so darn friendly. you know, so I'm going to read a quote to you because I want to, because maybe we're on the same page and we're just jerks other than you, and we're looking and we're speaking past each other. I'm going to read a quote to you, and I want to say if this is something you could affirm, but take into account, again, this is a Latin father, and to be according to, their own intellect, their own words and their intellectual tradition. So I'm going to read, I've read this before. It's a quote from St. Gregory the Great on the Moralia on Job. This is book 18 for those following, paragraph 32 to 33. He says, and I guess I could screen share it. Those people, what's there? He was born and baptized that by his passion he might purify the water. So right from Ignatius, I forgot that. I'm so happy you brought that up. I totally forgot that. So I'm going to now share screen. That ain't working. All right, stop screen, share screen again, Chrome tab, and you're seeing an unfinished article where I have these quotes. And I don't know how big that is. I could try to make it bigger. Bigger. All right. So St. Greg the Great says this: by the burning effect of the scorching wind, the mind of each one of the elect is cooled down when the heat of evil inclinations is extinguished therein, and the flame of carnal desires turned to ice. The minds of the righteous are brought from the irritation and heat of bad habits to coolness and quietness of the thoughts, while they now no longer seek earthly things, while they extinguish the flames of the flesh by heavenly aspirations. In reference to this cooling of the soul, which is given from heaven, it is said to Mary, the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Though on this point, by the term of the overshadowing, either nature of God to be made incarnate might have been denoted. For a shadow is followed by light in body. Now the Lord is light in respect of the divine nature, who by means of a soul intervening, vouchsafed in her womb in respect of human nature to become a body, and so because the incorporeal light was in her womb to be made corporeal, to her who conceived the incorporeal from her corporality, it is said, the power of the highest shall overshadow thee, i.e. the corporeal light of the divine nature shall in thee take the corporeal substance of human nature. If people are wondering why I kept the whole apart, is so that way you could get some sort of sense of the context and the application he ultimately makes. But so we see there that we're seeing cooling of the soul is extinguishing the heat of evil inclinations. And so my question now to you, Subdeacon, would you find it objectionable, whether, and this could beyond the Syriac tradition, anyone the Oriental Orthodox communion, to understand that for Mary to be purified or during the Annunciation to be overshadowed by the Holy Spirit, that when her mind was purified, it was a purification from the passions. That's how I read that. Would that be unjustified? Do you think it's justified, but it's another justified reading? Do you think this is just too out there? What's your view?
I have no knowledge of Gregory the Great. I don't.
But he's
know.
great.
I'm sure that if you have, I'm guessing Latins, if you have Latins on the show, they would probably disagree with the interpretation of the quote. I'm pretty sure you agree that they would disagree with that. So I'm not. I don't know. I can't really judge by just the quote. I'd have to know the way he thinks about the other things um, regarding Mary.
Oh
Um,
yeah, more context obviously doesn't hurt interpretation.
yeah.
My point is more this, is that we have fathers, because St. Ambrose also talks about it, that speak about a purification, not just enabling, that Mary's mind was made ready. So like, for example, in liturgy, St. Basil, I don't know, in the Syriac version, it's probably not in it, I'm going to guess, but who knows, that there's a prayer before the consecration for the same purification. Now, most likely, I'm going to go out on a limb, they're not talking about thinking of any sort of sin they committed behind the iconostasis, right? That's not the point. It's to be in the right frame of mind to be part of something that is miraculous, that is not possible. The eternal entering the material realm, right? That's what happens in the consecration. And so, and not only that, the material realm, it's even more confusing. Bread and wine is actually flesh and blood. So it's several levels of miraculous.
Right.
So that's why I bring this up. There's this broad view where we have to think about that. I think as an Orthodox Christian, it's always about us turning from passions. We're always purifying ourselves in repentance. God is purifying us when he gives us the grace of repentance, when he gives us the grace of doing good works, right? Like Ephesians says that work out your salvation, fear, and trembling, for it's God who works with you to work and will for your, his good pleasure.
Yeah.
And that's Philippians 2:12 to 2:13. So I cannot help but read these things within an Orthodox soteriological paradigm. And being that Greek writers, Syriac writers are Orthodox, and they're speaking about that in those senses, that's how I see the word purification. Now, when we see Gregory the Great, they don't talk about the passion. That never exists, but they generally don't talk about the passion. These are the words they use to talk about those same things. And so that's why it's important for us who are reading, hopefully, because you commended everyone to read all the nativity homilies from all the Syriac authors. For us to get a view of what these concepts are amongst the different people God has called into the bosom of the church, right? I'm an Italian Jew. You don't take issue with the term Arab, right?
No.
My landlord does. Like, I'm not an Arab. I'm an Assyrian. Like, okay.
Well, just clear, because my dad is an Arab, but my mom's not. She's Assyrian, just like so. That she would take issue with it, but my dad is actually an Arab.
All right, so you're an Arab Assyrian.
Yeah.
So it's just like me when because I was brought up by my father. I could actually say I grew up in an Italian household, but I could be whatever race I choose to be in the situation that suits me. So that's why I bring that up. I think when we see in those hymns where it talks about death and sin and filthiness, that we have to read it within this soteriological paradigm of the passions, and I do not think that would be eisegetical. But I think Elijah has a question, and I think that's our last question, and that'll be it for today. I'm just going to put it up there. Craig, what do you think of Dr. Brock, saying that Mary's purification was an increase in holiness rather than taking away of anything sinful? Isn't that what Father Capps concludes? You were in that interview, so correct me if I'm wrong, Subdeacon Dan. But the answer I heard was, I don't know, I'm guessing. It doesn't sound like he affirmed your viewpoint. I think that'd be inaccurate. So I would reject the premise of the question. Let me take it down so people could see your face and you could give your response.
So I came away with it affirming that, because maybe I'm taking into account more than what he answered, also what I've read from him, also what I've emailed back and forth, just the context of the conversations I've had with Dr. Brock. So maybe that's why I took it for more than maybe he was being less clear with his answer. It could be because of what you said, Craig, about maybe the question didn't allow him to be more affirmative regarding the answer. But generally speaking, that is the sense I get from Brock regarding the Annunciation, is that what happened to Mary was like, I don't know if this is sacrilegious or not, but it's kind of like Mario when he eats the mushroom and then he like gets even better. You know what I'm saying? So it's like a plus. I don't think from Brock nor from the poems that I've read in the Syriac tradition or what I've seen is that something that is negative in Mary being taken away from Mary, rather an enhancement of her holiness, of what and the glory she puts on moving forward.
No, but wouldn't you think that Saint Gregory the Great, extinguishing of evil inclinations, isn't that an enhancing of holiness as well?
Gregory the Great, as you showed, he's talking about evil inclinations, and he's talking about passion, like carnal desires. He said things that I don't see in Ephrem or the Syriac tradition. So obviously, there it's a totally different ballgame. I have no idea. It's a good question. I don't know how. Obviously,
Because here's where I quibble. Because I think what it sounds like you're doing, I know Elijah is, for example, is to automatically concluding that if a soul or intellect is being purified and that there's a positive effect of that, then it's almost like you went to college and got smarter, or you fasted more and you got holier. That's the only way you're seeing it.
No.
And like I said, it's when I see that topic treated more broadly in the fathers, they're always speaking of, yes, we're getting holier because we're becoming purified from the passions, right? I mean, clearly that's what St. Gregory is talking about.
Right.
And without positively denying that in St. Ephrem, right, what you would have to posit to take your interpretation is that Mary's purification, Mary's baptism is fundamentally different than everyone else's, because I read in those hymns, I think it was the word soul. Come on, Control F. You're supposed to help me. I probably can't find it.
It's hymn
not
16.
Fast enough.
Hymn 16.
That it's called shortcomings. It's called Mary speaks about being purchased, and we're being cleansed from filth. Again, this is St. Ephrem. I'm using his words. But there's something with the word soul there, and when Control F is not working, I can't find it that fast. I don't like when stuff don't work, but oh well. I can't give you a perfect show on the fly, guys. I think I did pretty good overall. You guys, I read it. You could go back to those sources.
Look, I'm not saying that Gregory the Great and Ephrem are not compatible. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we cannot take from Ephrem only and then imply that he also means these other things. We have to take only from what he's saying. So if when we're reading about Ephrem, his Mariology, not just Ephrem, Jacob, and then that whole kind of group together, we see what their Mariology is like, then we will know a fuller picture of how they view Mary, not just at the Annunciation, but in general. And then when we see what happens to her at the Annunciation, it'll make more sense for what they mean about this purification. That now she, even, which Brock also answers, he said, now she understands the will of God more, her understanding of God's will for her life. This is how he views it. Oh, you're making perfect. That's great. You're sending him an email?
Yeah, I can send that to you to email. I can't remember your email. We'll talk about that. Okay. I actually think what we were referencing was in the earlier question. It was in number 2, and it was hymn 2, and it was in reference to Zechariah 3:3. Yeah. Because it flat out said in Zechariah 3:3, and this is about us, right? So if we're going to say, oh, it's just positive, it's just us getting holier, remember, this is ascribed to us. and it says, he also stripped and took off from us the clothing of our filthiness. Glory be to him on high, who mixed his salt in our minds, his leaven in our souls. And so if we're speaking of, yes, that intellectual purification, it's the same one we have. And we have to understand that with an orthodox soteriological paradigm that he would have had. So I guess that's my point.
For the Syriacs, Mary was unique in that she really is for them from the earliest times the second Eve. Like, I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong. I'm just saying we have to look at it from what they're saying. We have to look at it from, okay, if they're viewing her as the second Eve, what do they mean by this? And then if they're saying about her that she's unique, what do they mean she's unique? In which way? So we have to look at it from them alone, and then we can see if what they're saying is compatible with the rest of Christendom. We can't just assume that all of Christendom is compatible. We have to.
And that's an excellent point. That's why I'm so happy to have you on. It's excellent because I said from the onset, I have an interpretive bias that they're gonna agree. It takes to me a large burden of proof to say that they don't. So we're speaking of saints.
Yeah.
And you're coming from, which I think more, especially modern scholars are going to agree with you. Your interpretive bias is we're aware of different schools of thoughts, obviously different ethnic backgrounds, different language groups. They're going to have different intellectual paradigms. I'm more interested to see what it means precisely within the Syriac worldview. And then after that, we compare whether it agrees with everything else, because it might not. It might be independent to the Syriac worldview. So that's where you're coming from, which is completely defensible, and I completely understand. Like I said, I read, this sounds wrong. My attempt in reading the Fathers is to presume that the same Spirit inspired all of them. I know you don't disagree with that either, but clearly intellectual, post-enlightenment thought does not believe that. And so when we use textual criticism to understand something, that takes us away from that sort of bias. If you read the councils, clearly they would have read history in the sense that I'm giving. And so we could maybe do another show. We could get this is my Protestant interlocutor on Cool Cal, that's him. And we could speak more about the reading of history because that's a bigger topic. But
and I don't want to get into it too much either, but just for you to get another example of where Christendom does disagree with each other. For example, Genesis 6 in the sons of God situation there. For the Syriacs, it's blasphemous to say that they're angels. For the Ethiopians and the Eritreans, of course it's angels. Who else would it be? And we're in communion with each other. So how does that work? I don't know. But there's two contradictory traditions. Even in the United Church before the schisms of the councils, there's contradictory opinions on this, and communion was still preserved, despite the Fathers contradicting exegesis on this passage. Just for information.
All right. Well, again, that's a bigger issue for two reasons. One, I don't think any of our communions believes there's an authoritative interpretation of any specific scripture. I know that St. Maximus says that every single scripture he uses the word because God's infinite, has infinite interpretations. So meaning you get both interpretations, they could be correct. But I don't want to poo-poo away differences. We have saints that clearly disagree. At the same time, writing the same language. St. Cyprian and St. Pope Stephen I. They're in opposition on the same issue. So this does exist. And so that's why, of course, I'm aware of that. But our presumption should be that unless there is no other explanation, we should be reading the saints charitably that they agree with one another. I know that that's not the modern intellectual way of reading them, but I do think that's how the saints read the saints. And that's my interpretive bias. Keyword is bias. I can't prove to you it's correct. I want to put this question up because I think you're the better person to answer it. What are your thoughts and Daniel's thoughts on Jacob of Sarug saying that Mary became like Eve before the fall at the Annunciation?
You want to go first, Craig?
I have not read Jacob Sarug, so I can't give intelligent thoughts. But
and then again, just for whoever wants to read what he's referring to, it's in that book, the one I mentioned earlier on the show. So I hinted at it before that for Jacob, Mary was like Eve before the Annunciation, but at the Annunciation, she becomes like almost super Eve, or even more
Super
so.
Saiyan 2 or Super Saiyan 3?
It's she takes on another level to the point where Jacob then later says, even regarding her dormition, which is also in the book, he says she tasted death so that she might taste the cup of her son, like as if it was her choice. So then you see for and Jacob says he talks about purification more than Ephrem. Like he takes everything Ephrem does and he expounds on it. So he talks about in more. So there's not much left for us to be guessing, right? With Ephraim, he doesn't talk as much about something, and then Jacob gives us what we were missing. So he talks about her what is the word, like her thoughts and all of these things. Jacob talks about it, and then he talks about it before the fall, and then he talks about it at the Annunciation, what happened, and then he talks about it afterwards. Uh, I really encourage you to read it. Please, I know we're living in 2020 in America. Please, when you are reading these things from Ephraim and Jacob and others, do not think Immaculate Conception. Do not think opposite of Immaculate Conception. Do not think about it. Read it for what it's saying. Don't read it for there is this argument I'm having on Facebook or wherever that you have people are having these arguments, WhatsApp, whatever it is. So then I need this to defend my position or not to defend my position or whatever it is. This is not what they're talking about. They're not talking about Latin things that are happening in the 19th century and after. They're talking about whatever they believe in that time for them, the way they're thinking about the thing. So and sad to say, I feel like.
Are you still here?
What is it?
All right, you're breaking up a tiny bit.
Oh, I said sad to say, I feel like this stuff is becoming important only because of the Immaculate Conception argument. And this is not what this is about. This is not what it was intended to be. And it's so rich and beautiful for itself. It's not fair to this tradition to become only important because people want to prove the Immaculate Conception or disprove the Immaculate Conception, because it's not for that purpose.
Yeah, I hope to be doing a very large show soon, specifically on the Orthodox teaching of Mariology, because to me, we're the church. This is our teaching. We don't have to affirm your ideas out there. This is the ideas that our church affirms. And that's what's often lost in all of this. But I want to just answer this part of this question. I really don't understand why. I mean, no one's arguing Mary wasn't the second Eve until her baptism during the Incarnation. So I don't understand the premise of the question. I mean, Mary is predestined for the Incarnation. You know, she's some later Greek fathers said purified at conception. Her ancestors had dispassionate, I can't pronounce the word, but copulation. You know, they came together and it was dispassionate. This is peculiar. Mary was preserved to be especially holy. She's all holy. Okay. So we have to be careful not to say, well, this is so exceptional, it must mean this idea, which Elijah, who's the question here, admits was not on their radar. So we have to understand the idea, as you were saying, within the context of those people. And that's why, to be honest, this segue I have taken to Mariology has not been one I really wanted to do. I have to say, I ended my own stream. Because now when I go to church, I could listen to the hymns. I actually know what they're talking about. so that is nice. And that will, by God's grace, for many, many years, be a blessing to me and to my family. But that has to be our primary motivation. My motivation for this show is to encourage people to look at these texts not as polemicists, but to look at them first and foremost as Christians, and second as intellectuals. We forget about that. It's not about winning an argument. First, we want to be holy, but we're not always so holy. All right, so we're not so holy. Let's at least try to be smart when we're at it. And I'm not saying that as a backhanded insult to reason theology. That's not my point. I've done this with Formula Hornistas and other stuff in other shows. This is a thing that's important to me. Is we have to read the news, we have to read the fathers, we have to read history. I want to talk to my wife. All these things have to be done in intellectual, logical ways, and not about just winning. Okay, yeah. So that's an important thing. I want to end the show with one note, which is talking on a topic that is not what we just talked about. And so with coronavirus, when's your church open back up? Do you know?
It's not really closed. Like, they're still doing masses. There's still about 10. A Middle Eastern 10, if you know what I mean, amount of people in the Paris. It's just when. So I'm gonna answer it as in, when is the rotation stuff over, and then everybody can just go like normal.
Well, that might never happen, actually.
That scares me. We're hoping in May, like this month. We're hoping, but maybe we're just being crazy. I don't know. I don't think that the Orthodox can handle much more of this. I think eventually there's going to start being some resistance, and generally, I'm not saying from my parish, but
weather's good.
What is it?
Weather's good. I want to go swimming.
Yeah.
Sadly, that's how people operate. I'll make this. I've been increasing my comments on this issue. First and foremost, the reason we were born, our whole reason for existing, is to worship God. That is non-negotiable. Anyone that teaches otherwise, encourages otherwise, for the most good of reasons, sadly is mistaken. Hopefully out of stupidity, worst out of heresy or wickedness. I prefer to think just stupid. So that's something that people have to take into account. Our first foremost obligation to worship God. Now, that doesn't mean we ought to be stupid in doing it. That's what people don't get. Like I see on my Facebook feed these. All right, I'm white, so I'm going to say this. These pieces of WT yelling and screaming, and Trump 2020 flags. Listen, that ain't me. I think that's stupid. There's nothing wrong with being intelligent. All right, and so what could churches do? They could limit the amount of numbers. They could bring pre-sanctified gifts to people's homes. If you're Roman Catholic, they could just do 20 masses in a day. I mean, I don't know about, we don't do that. It's Orthodox. We can't serve the liturgy more than once on an altar. A priest can't serve it more than once. But you could do it that way. You could do liturgies on more than one day, as in, several days a week. This is not the catacombs. There's so many ways to work around this. There has to be some will to do it. And also, we got to be, as Christians, responsible citizens. Don't take, just because you believe it's your right not to wear a face mask, right? Just like it's your human right not to wear a seatbelt. Doesn't matter what the law is. It's your basic human right to be stupid. Doesn't mean someone else wants it in their conscience when they crash in your car and they kill your kid because you didn't belt them in. That's just being selfish. So,
right. Let me ask you this.
Sure.
What's the percentage you think of Orthodox in America who view this as a break from church, like a good thing? Like, oh, good, we don't have to go.
We're talking about my church, I think, before the show. So in my church, I think they're more confused than anything. Okay. Some people, we want to be careful. All of us could experience pre-lust or spiritual pride. Is this my time in the wilderness? Is this, we don't want to think about it like that. You know what I mean? We're laymen. You're not, but I'm a layman. This is not my time in the wilderness. I still go to the supermarket and buy ice cream. This is not time in the wilderness, let's be honest. If I were to guess, so larger, because I've been speaking to other Orthodox that are just normal, nominal people outside my church, it's a break, but because they're first and foremost Americans before they're Orthodox. Like, the government says so, okay, guess I won't go. It sucked to miss Pascha, but oh well. My big fat Greek life. That's what one person told me. So that exists. If you want me to guess a percent, I'd say probably 80 to 90% are happy.
Wow.
I'm guessing.
I think I agree with that.
Most Orthodox aren't recent immigrants from persecuted countries. So I don't know a lot of Arab Antiochian Orthodox, so I don't know if it's different for their recent immigrants. But I would say Greeks and Russians, I'd say 80, 90%. And amongst those who are dissatisfied, doesn't mean all of them want to go to church. A lot of them say, this is my time in wilderness, or this is my bishop says, and they think they should take it lying down. And I think time will show this is a bigger spiritual issue. In the past, we always ran to God to solve our problems, especially the big ones. And by the way, quarantines are nothing new. Russia had quarantines for plague since the 1600s. They had processions in the streets to deal with these things. In fact, recorded secular history says the plague didn't get worse after the procession. Now, again, that's secular history from the 1800s. So I'm not saying it's super accurate. And by the way, Russia was not exactly a holy land in the 1800s. I don't think this was a religious take on it. It probably got warm out and then it stopped. But again, that's God's sovereignty over the weather. But they cleaned coins back then. They knew washing got rid of dirtiness. So there's nothing wrong with the government taking measures to stop disease. This is not me speaking Constitution, speaking as a Christian. We ought to submit to the government. But what we can't submit to is not worshiping God. That's number one. There's nothing more important than that. Now, worshiping God may mean different things for different people. For some people that cut off from all churches, they could be in Saudi Arabia. It could be a completely solitary activity. May God preserve their souls. Okay. For other people, they're in, I'm just going to make up Nebraska, and the closest Oriental or Eastern Orthodox church is 200-300 miles away, if not more. It's also a solitary activity. In exile, it's always been acceptable to God to fast, give alms, and to pray. God will accept that spiritual worship. We see that in the book of Tobit. We see it in the book of Esther. That's always existed. We do not deny that. But what is the excuse of us that have churches? We don't have geographic limitations. What did the church do in the past during persecution or these limitations? They gave pre-sanctified gifts, because we read that in Basil's letter. St. Dionysius Alexandria talks about it. And with this, which is not even a persecution, just follow the law and be creative about it. You use it, count it, right? It's not a sin to figure out a way to pay less taxes. So it's not a sin to figure out a way to worship more. And there has to be the will for it. And I think we've been betrayed by not all bishops. I know bishops that haven't, high up bishops that haven't. But we've been betrayed by a lot of bishops that have. I don't know why. But we have to have the humility to know that they could end up being the saints. And those proceeding from us will be venerating them. And we will be forgotten. Because they could end up doing something great. We don't know why God ordained this.
Yeah. And the pre-sanctified gifts that you mentioned, that is a consistent thing that they did during these times. So that should at least be
a no-brainer. The priest should be fast, pray, watch it on Zoom if you want, and don't eat until I drive to their house and bring you the gifts.
Right?
And I hate to say this, God forbid, because I'm not saying the Lord's name in vain. They used to give people more than one day's worth of the Eucharist. They trusted you with it.
Yeah, I know.
What's that say of our faith that we can't take the Eucharist in our hand anymore because people are afraid we're going to give it to chickens for cockfighting? Because that's why they started giving it the spoon. We're not infants. My son needs a spoon, but I don't. I can lick my hands. Don't to be gross, but
I know.
I've seen priests pick the Eucharist right off the floor, and eat it. We have saints that ate it that was vomited out from people. We have stories of saints doing that, like St. John Maximovich. So it's there has to be some trust for the laity, where you have to tell them, listen, if I'm going to give you more than one day's worth, you have to do all this fasting, all these prayers. I need to know that you're spiritually capable of it, because it's not heretical to do that. So there's so many ways around this.
Yeah.
And there's a lack of will to do it. And only God knows people's hearts. And only God knows the future. All we could say is what's true, what happened in the past, and with the hope that by our prayers, we'll be stronger and better than ever before because of our faults and the things we've done that are wrong. I know I've learned from my mistakes. I'm sure, Elijah Yassi will learn from his after the questions he asked in that show. We all learn from our mistakes. And if more people were Dan, we would just be blessed to know, because we don't never make mistakes. I'm joking. So that would be my comments. It was so great having you on short notice.
Thank you.
Hopefully we can do something again, maybe on the reading of history, or something like that. I think my overtime is ending soon, so I'll be doing more regular shows. And is there any other comments you'd like to make before we close?
That's it. I'll remember to send you that book, and then whoever's interested, again, the Jacob of Saruj on the Mother of God on Amazon, $14, guys. Don't be cheap. $14.
All right. On Amazon. I'm going to put my website, orthodoxchristiantheology.com. If this or anything else we've done has blessed you, go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. I don't get the money. It goes to the church in Russia that then is in Cambodia, and it blesses Cambodians that are Orthodox, as well as expats that are, in fact, South Africans and Americans also in Cambodia. So you could do that if you feel blessed and you feel compelled to give. Otherwise, give to your local monastery, give to the local poor person, or whatever you have. Though in America, he's got a Trump check, so he might not need it. So do that. Otherwise, share this video and pray for us. So, guys, God bless you.